Welcome to Counseling Foundations. We're covering Chapter 11 on psychopharmacology. This is a very important chapter because it covers the range of psychotropic medications that we use in our field. And as clinicians, we must be familiar with them and understand their names, their usages, their side effects, because you're really the first point of contact a lot of times for individuals who need psychotropic medication. You're the referral source, or you're monitoring the person, the client, far more than the doctor or the psychiatrist. And a large number of our population actually takes a prescription drug. A statistic from 2013 said 70% of the population is taking a prescription drug. Now that number is a little different for psychotropics. And psychotropics, I mean to treat a mental health disorder. That's what psychotropic medication is. And in 2010, 20% of adults and 6% of children were being prescribed a psychotropic medication. And we have other recent information. This is just a Google article, but it is backed up in peer-reviewed journals. So in 2022, January 2022, more than 24% of Americans were taking a mental health med. That was 1 out of 4 people. And so I believe that may be even higher, and this is what we know, but we know that that number has increased exponentially. And if you think about it, that means how much of your caseload is going to come in either on a psychotropic med, having taken one, or needing to take one as a result of what we have all been enduring over the past 2 years. It really has changed the landscape of how we treat our clients. But all that to say, a basic understanding of the brain and the neurochemistry of the brain is paramount, and you understanding how these medications work. And you have to be well versed in this in order to talk with your clients. So we're going to start at the very basics here with just a neuron or a nerve cell. A neuron and a nerve cell is the same thing. And really, they make up the brain and the spinal cord and the peripheral nervous system. And there are over 100 billion nerve cells in our body. And each one of these neurons or nerves has the same fundamental parts as listed on this diagram that I have up here on the PowerPoint. Every single one of them has a cell, which is called the cell body or the soma. It contains the cell nucleus, and the cell nucleus contains all the genetic information that's responsible for basically telling the cell what to do. When a neuron's not working, it's kind of chilling out and resting. It's in what we call a relaxed or resting potential state. But when the communication needs to occur and information needs to process, like for a motor or sensory neuron, so a motor neuron to move, then they're going to send chemical messengers from one neuron to another until that movement is created in the body. So the information comes from the other neighboring neurons through the dendrites. And you can see on the diagram, number 1, those are the dendrites. You see the cell body or the soma is right there in 2, and then the nucleus in 8 is where the genetic information is, and that's telling the cell what it's supposed to be doing. So when the neuron receives that information through the dendrites, it either receives a message to inhibit or excite. And when those neurons are ready to send the signals, they go through that long axon terminal down to those terminal buttons at the end. And you see those on number 5, the terminal buttons and axon terminal. And the terminal buttons there at the end are where neurotransmitters are stored. And you hear that word a lot, but we're going to talk more about what neurotransmitters mean. But before we do that, let's talk about the different kinds of neurons. There are sensory neurons and motor neurons. And do you see how they look a little bit different? A sensory neuron carries sensory impulses from sensory organs to the central nervous system. And the motor neuron is just like it says. It is responsible for motor. We just mentioned what neurons do when they either inhibit or excite. And this just shows you a little bit more information of what an excitatory versus an inhibitory response does. I don't expect you to know the depolarization and hyperpolarization, the sodium and the chloride. You may remember that from other courses, but we won't get into that in this one. But excitatory, it increases the likelihood that the message will be forwarded on, but inhibitory decreases the likelihood it will be passed on. When the excitatory response in the top is happening, it is called an action potential. There's that sodium, and you may remember that may be coming back for you from a class you've had previously. So you're going to hear about neurotransmitters a lot because they're mainly what affects mental health, and they are what is affected in most of the psychotropic meds for different disorders. And so I have a diagram here of the main ones so that you can memorize this and look at it, and it's pleasing to the eye, so that you understand what is happening with these neurotransmitters. There are actually 3 types of neurotransmitters that are listed in your text. There's the biogenic amine, the amino acid, and the peptide. The biogenic amine is some of the most common ones that you hear about in mental health: serotonin, norepinephrine, epinephrine, dopamine, histamine, and acetylcholine. These terminate the action of the released neurotransmitter in the gap between the 2 neurons. It recycles the unused neurotransmitter for future use. Hence, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which we'll talk about in a little bit, where it's creating more serotonin and keeping it from being taken back up into the neuron. So amino acid is used as a building block for protein. That's another type of neurotransmitter. And the ones that are in that category are GABA and glutamate. And then we have peptides. And peptides are mainly in relation to mediation of pain, appetite stimulation, and mood regulation. So those are the 3 categories, but these are the main ones that you're going to really discuss and know about right here. I just skipped ahead here, but this is where we're talking about a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And the way that this works with the serotonin from the terminal button that we went back and let me go back here. Look at that right here. This is that synapse right here in between the dendrite of another neuron here, and then the terminal buttons here. So you see that happening here, and it's a larger picture so that you can see that neurotransmitter, that serotonin, released in the synapse. There's the postsynaptic nerve, the receptor sites right there. And you see how that's working and staying out in the synapse for more of an effect. It's inhibiting the reuptake of the serotonin. So what's noteworthy about this is that there are over 10,000 synaptic connections and action potentials with excitatory. Remember, we just talked about that, those action potentials. They do not have enough charge to cross through those synapses on their own. They have to rely on what availability of the neurotransmitter, and that neurotransmitter boosts them through the synaptic gap there. And as that travels through the axon, the cell enters a state of exocytosis. Yeah. Once that potential occurs, that presynaptic neuron, which is the one at the top, acts quickly to retrieve the unused neurotransmitter and recycles for future use, which is what we've been talking about with the SSRI. That is called reuptake. That's the R in the SSRI, which many of you may know, but you may not. In a perfectly healthy brain, this process works great. But when we have mental health issues, this is not a streamlined process. And that's where we get into issues and why we need to use psychotropic medication. So sometimes there's not enough of the potential, there's not enough of the receptors, there's not enough of a flow or a cleanup in between the two, and those messages are not being conveyed. And so that is when a medication can be helpful. And your text lists some things here to help our body retain what we would like to maintain a homeostasis or balance. And that is increasing the amount of neurotransmitters produced by the presynaptic neuron and released in the synapse, or blocking the reuptake of the neurotransmitter, binding to the receptor site on the postsynaptic neuron, disabling the activity of the neurotransmitter present in the synapse, or inhibiting the enzymes that break down neurotransmitters, changing the sensitivity of postsynaptic neurons to neurotransmitters. And the way that these drugs get into the body is in a variety of ways. And these are definitely terms that you should know as a clinician, because your clients may be prescribed medication in different forms, or they may be talking about medication, and you need to know. Oral is by mouth, intravenous is IV, of course, is the quickest way. Transdermal patch is the skin.